If you want something done right, do it yourself. This was precisely the motto adopted by the family of the deceased woman who unexpectedly passed away in her own bed. A self-centered spouse, an inexperienced investigator, and a lack of any evidence led to her death being deemed an accident. It was at this point that her parents, who didn't believe their daughter had been deceiving them, took matters into their own hands. Christina Ann Thompson, or Christy as her loved ones called her, was born on January 16, 1978 in Flint, Michigan, to Katie and Harvey. For most of her upbringing, she was raised not by her biological father, but by her stepfather Jim, whom she regarded as her dad. Christy also had two wonderful sisters. She was a remarkable individual, the life of any gathering. Cheerful, sociable, and candid, she enjoyed being the center of attention, making others grin and chuckle. Christy adored hosting game nights at home when the whole family came together. In her spare time, she engaged in swimming and scrapbooking. Scrapbooking is a pastime involving the creation and decoration of albums with various clippings, mementos, and souvenirs. All of this is done by hand, resulting in unique photo albums that can be given as gifts or kept as personal keepsakes. It was in these handmade albums that a piece of Christy's spirit was preserved. Her parents, with tears in their eyes, would flip through the pages adorned by their daughter's hand when she was far from them. In 1997, the young woman met Jason Harris at a party, and although they were complete opposites, as they say, opposites attract. Jason, a quiet, shy guy, reserved with his emotions, and the cheerful Christy were very different. But from their first encounter, they found common ground and soon began dating. Despite their completely mismatched personalities, they seemed like an excellent couple. In 2003, Christy and Jason tied the knot. The bride that day, according to friends, simply radiated with joy. In 2009, the couple welcomed their first daughter, Haley. Christina proved herself to be a magnificent mother from day one, as if her entire previous life had been spent preparing for motherhood. The first child is a complete restructuring of young parents' lives. Now they were forced to fully orient themselves to the needs and desires of their little one, rather than following their own habits. For many, this process doesn't go so smoothly. However, for Christina, the transition to motherhood came naturally. Haley became her whole world. Christy was ready to do everything possible and impossible to ensure her child's well-being, to give her the best life and care. In May 2014, the Harris family was expecting another addition. They named their second daughter Kaylee. More than anything in the world, Christy loved her girls. She was devoted to them until the very end. And it turned out that her dedication and efforts in caring for the newborn ultimately became important key evidence in this case. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. Let's move forward a few months to September 2014. Christy had given birth to her daughter via C-section. By this time, the woman had already returned to work but still continued to breastfeed, believing it helped strengthen the baby's health. This is why she constantly had to spend hours pumping and storing enough milk so that whoever was watching Kaylee could feed her on time while Christy was at work. Pumping is a rather laborious process that takes a lot of time. Christy strictly adhered to a pumping schedule and was very meticulous in creating labels for marking bottles. She vigilantly monitored what she ate and drank, knowing it would affect the quality and quantity of breast milk and, ultimately, the child's health. All this is not random information. It later had enormous significance for understanding the case. The Harrises lived in their own house in Davison, Michigan. And although neighbors and loved ones knew their marriage was going through difficult times, they all noted that Christy never gave up and continued to be a devoted mother to her children. She was described as a responsible and kind-hearted person who greeted everyone with a smile and was always ready to lend a helping hand. September 29, 2014, began like a typical morning. Jason took the older Haley to preschool and 4-month-old Kaylee to his wife's parents. Christy was supposed to be getting ready for work at this time, but she continued to lie in bed, and Jason knew about this. He just didn't want other people to know that he was aware of what was happening. It wasn't long before Harris began to implement his devious plan. First, the man wrote to a neighbor that he had been unable to contact Christy all morning. He asked his wife in a text message if she had woken up, but received no response. Perhaps she had overslept, not hearing the alarm because a couple of days before this she had been feeling a bit under the weather. Now the loving husband was worried if everything was all right there. However, Jason was little concerned about what psychological trauma the neighbor would experience when entering their family home. The kind woman, of course, offered to immediately go to the Harris residence to find out why Christina wasn't responding to her husband's calls and messages. The neighbor didn't even realize what a horrific scene she was about to witness. She found Christy lying in her bed. The homeowner was cold to the touch, and white foam had settled on her lips. The distressed neighbor rushed to the phone and immediately called the emergency service 911, then dialed the number of another neighbor who was a certified nurse, asking her to urgently come to the Harris house. Unfortunately, the second woman only confirmed what could be guessed at first glance. Christy Harris had left this world, and no life-saving measures would bring her back. This was the conclusion reached by the emergency response team as soon as they arrived at the house. They pronounced the homeowner dead and conducted a very brief and fruitless investigation. There were no suspicious details at the scene, no signs of struggle, no weapons, no signs of forced entry, nothing that could indicate a potential cause of Christina's death, except for some painkillers prescribed to her after the C-section. The pills were on the bedside table. Everything else looked as if a completely healthy 36-year-old woman had just died in her sleep. Such an outcome, of course, is quite possible, but in very, very rare cases. The only small clue, which at first wasn't even considered a clue, was that Christina had died with foam in her mouth. This could have been an overdose of an unknown substance, but only a pathologist could determine that for sure. At the first stage, it was believed that the mother of two had died in her sleep. When the body was taken for medical examination, Christy's loved ones remained at the scene, at the Harris residence, still unable to comprehend and accept the monstrous news. They wondered what could have happened. The tragedy shocked everyone. Christina had always been completely healthy and felt fine the day before, had no pre-existing conditions or anything like that that could explain the sudden death. Her unexpected passing caused a lot of speculation and assumptions among relatives, but Jason Harris outdid them all. The man suddenly told the police that the previous evening Christy had been acting a bit strange. For dinner, he had prepared her a bowl of cereal with milk after she complained of being hungry, but she ate almost nothing as she fell asleep right at the table, dropping her spoon. Jason had to carry her to the bedroom, where she slept all night. Apparently, she was still feeling unwell. The man stated that a couple of days ago, Christy had been slightly ill. According to her spouse, he had the impression that his wife was fine when he was getting ready for work and dressing the children for daycare that morning. This concluded his conversation with the police. He wasn't called for further questioning, and absolutely nothing followed that could reveal the true cause of the young woman's sudden death. If the investigators had exercised due diligence and actually spoken with Jason or other neighbors again, they would have easily determined that there was a culprit in this tragedy. They would have, at least, been able to gather evidence, particularly the bowl of cereal, or even search the house. But the detectives did none of the above. They simply believed Jason's account. However, his words at the police station and those said to neighbors differed greatly. On that very morning when Christina was found dead in her bed, her husband was talking to residents of nearby houses and complaining that his wife wasn't the angel her parents thought she was, and sometimes dabbled in illicit substances. He made various slanderous statements that didn't correspond to reality. Yet his behavior could have served as a red flag, literally screaming that something wasn't right here. It was too bold and disrespectful to speak about his spouse in such a manner when she had passed away just a couple of hours ago. There was no sense in running to the nearest neighbors and telling tall tales, but Jason was so reckless and overconfident that he sincerely believed he would get away with everything. On October 22, 2014, the police received the autopsy results. It showed that Christy died due to the effects of a psychoactive drug. The pathologist also found that the substance was taken orally. However, this drug isn't typically consumed by swallowing. Yet the medical examiner somehow didn't consider the fact that in Christy's case, the powder entered her system through the mouth, and the woman's death was ruled an accidental overdose. The pathologist assumed that Christina deliberately used mind-altering substances. Even after her family contacted the police to state that Christy never had any addictions, especially during the time she was pumping breast milk for her daughter, the authorities did nothing about it. For several years, the sudden death of 36-year-old mother of two, Christina Harris, officially remained an accidental overdose. The initial investigation into the young woman's death proceeded relatively slowly, as the police had no serious reasons. If it was an unintentional loss of life, there was no point in allocating resources, and determining the circumstances of Christy's death didn't become a priority for detectives. Jason Harris, being a widower, could freely enjoy his life, which he did. It turned out that less than a month after his wife's funeral, the man brought a new woman into the house, who began living with him and his children. In fact, before marrying Christy, Jason had already been married, and he had 2 children from that relationship. Now, the man gained full custody of his daughters, in addition to partial custody of the children from his first marriage. His life quickly returned to normal, and his financial situation significantly improved. Harris received over $120,000 from a life insurance policy, paid off some debts, bought 2 cars for himself and his new girlfriend, and even purchased a brand new house. All his actions caused incredible fury in Christy's family. The deceased relatives had a gut feeling that Jason had something to do with his wife's death. Christy's mother, Kathy, had long considered her daughter's marriage unsuccessful. She had repeatedly suggested that she divorce her selfish husband. But Christy, like most women, believed that girls needed a father. Kathy also insisted that she had seen her daughter the day before her death. Contrary to Jason's statement, she wasn't sick at all and felt fine. For her parents, sisters, and friends, Christy's death was a tragedy. They lost a close and beloved person. Harris, on the other hand, gained a lot after her death, not to mention a new girlfriend. The widower was living a completely new life. He had a lot of money at his disposal and no longer mentioned the wife who had departed so suddenly. For most people, the death of a loved one is usually associated with days of mourning and prolonged depression. But Jason behaved as if he had buried a hamster or a parakeet, not his beloved wife and the mother of his children. In reality, Christina's relatives knew her marriage was in trouble, and her death came at a very convenient time for Jason. The woman had repeatedly complained to her close ones that her husband was cheating on her. It turned out that while she was undergoing a C-section, which is a serious operation requiring long recovery, Harris was sitting in the next room texting his mistress, at the very moment when his wife was suffering, giving life to his second daughter. Additionally, Christy once casually told a friend that if anything happened to her, her husband should be checked first. And Jason himself, whose self-importance was off the charts, not only said nasty things about his deceased wife, but also directly admitted to his colleagues that he wanted to get rid of her. Just before Christy's death, Jason openly asked his brother for a loan to buy a plane ticket. He was planning to visit his mistress and didn't hide it. Once at work, Jason inquired with colleagues about tasteless and odorless drugs capable of knocking someone out permanently. He recounted how he once secretly dissolved several sedative pills in a glass of water and offered it to his wife. But Christy tasted the bitterness and poured the water into the sink, so his plan didn't work. Then Jason decided to hire a hitman to do the job for him. The unfaithful husband even paid $5,000 for the service. However, the executor was arrested on another case, and the plan failed again. Harris had the audacity to suggest to his colleagues that one of them act as a mercenary. He promised to pay $10,000 after receiving Christy's life insurance. What's most surprising in this story is that the colleagues who so calmly discussed the plan of a real crime with Harris didn't even think to go to the police. This could have saved the life of a mother of two. Did they believe what Jason was saying? Or did they just consider his plans foolish, boasting not worth worrying about? Even his own sister Rachel didn't immediately report to the police when Jason let slip a year before the tragedy that he considered liquidating Christy the only way out of the marriage. Harris justified this by saying he didn't want to pay alimony. He had already divorced his first wife and now had to give part of his salary to her. He didn't want to get into this bondage again. The man even told his sister about his step-by-step plan for how he intended to send his second wife to the other world. Rachel stayed silent then, only sharing the information with another brother, Jeff, and a day later called him back saying Jason was joking. Yet she had the opportunity to prevent the crime and thereby save not only Christy but also her own brother from prison, because subsequently he did carry out the terrible plan. It turns out that many people knew about the planned crime, but no one said anything to anyone. This inaction is shocking and makes one lose faith in humanity. Jason's reason for treating his wife this way was that, according to him, Christy was lazy and did nothing around the house. Instead, she constantly nagged him about insignificant trifles. He also doubted whether he was the father of their second daughter. On the very morning when Christy was found dead, the grief-stricken husband called her employer and asked about life insurance money. A week later, he showed up at their office to inquire again. Harris' actions clearly indicated a lack of basic logic in his head, which ultimately helped solve this case. He didn't want to pay alimony to support his children after a divorce, but in the end, custody of them fell entirely on his shoulders. After receiving a $100,000 life insurance policy from Christy's employers and an additional $20,000 from his own job, he secured himself a couple of years of comfortable existence if managed correctly, but didn't consider that if his wife were alive, they would have earned more money as a family, so mathematics wasn't his strong suit either. However, all this would surface a bit later, while for now, Harris was happy that he had gained freedom and financial independence. He calmly arranged his life with a new girlfriend and thought he had brilliantly pulled off the operation to get rid of his annoying wife. However, Christy's family was relentless in their pursuit of justice. They were almost 100% sure that Jason had a hand in their daughter's and sister's death. But unfortunately, they couldn't prove it. They had no choice but to wait for the man to make a mistake. Although the police ruled Christy's death an accidental overdose and were in no hurry to investigate the causes, her parents hoped they could achieve vengeance for their daughter's death. From the day of her death, and in the following weeks, months, and years, they adhered to a certain tactic. Mom, stepfather, and sisters did everything possible to lull their former son-in-law into a false sense of security. They decided to maintain good relations with Jason because Christy's daughters were under his care. The grandparents now feared for their safety. They didn't know what else this man was capable of. By pretending that everything was fine and they hadn't figured anything out, Christy's close ones could remain as close as possible to their granddaughters. They cared for the girls' well-being and had to pretend in front of Jason for years. In reality, the deceased woman's parents remained in contact with the police all this time. Christy's mom, Kathy, emailed the detectives almost every day, reminding them that the case wasn't over yet. Her daughter still needed justice. She knew from the investigators that they entertained the idea of Jason's guilt, but until specific evidence was found, they couldn't do anything. It turned out that the police had shifted their work onto the shoulders of the victim's parents, and the family did everything to obtain this evidence because they themselves were tired of smiling at their former son-in-law and pretending that everything was wonderful. Christy's stepfather Jim was well versed in computers. One day, Jason complained that his home computer wasn't working. Jim gladly agreed to help his son-in-law with the problem, thus gaining access to the hard drive. There he found an image that was crucial to the investigation of Christy's death. It was a photo of Jason holding something like a tray on his lap. In his hand, he was clutching a glass tube. On the tray, there were clearly visible lines of a white powdery substance. To anyone, even an uninitiated person, it became clear what Harris was doing. Not only was the image quite compromising, but it also showed that Jason was not just a user of psychoactive substances, but had direct access to the type of drug found in Christy's system. Naturally, Jim brought this evidence directly to the police. The detectives dug a little into Harris' past and discovered some very interesting information. Just a few months after his wife's death, Jason was fired from his job for failing a drug test. The police also spoke with Harris' colleagues and learned that the man had long been having strange conversations about getting rid of his own wife. Only for some reason, no one took them seriously. Or perhaps the colleagues were afraid that they themselves would be implicated in concealing a crime and pretended not to believe his ravings. Evidence began to accumulate, and it seemed that the case was moving forward. Unfortunately, it was then that Jason sensed something was being plotted against him, so he turned to a lawyer and refused to answer police questions. Yes, this photograph was compromising, and the colleagues' testimonies were incriminating. But obviously, this wasn't enough to make an arrest and bring charges for the murder of his wife. And for the next 2 agonizing years, nothing happened. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this video. It's really important. During this time, Christy's mother, Kathy, diligently sought ways to achieve justice for her daughter, ways to somehow hold Jason accountable. In her research, the woman found out what they needed to do. Instead of pursuing criminal charges against their former son-in-law, the parents planned to file a civil wrongful death lawsuit. Kathy and Jim decided that this lawsuit would be the only way to draw attention to the case and help the family take some action against the alleged perpetrator. They hired a lawyer. As soon as the lawyer heard the details of this case, he was shocked that Harris was still free. The lawyer identified many reasons why the investigation should have started immediately. But the most important and obvious reason was that the drug that took Christy's life was taken orally. If she had been using it regularly, as her husband Jason claimed, she would surely have known the correct ways to take it. The family was lucky that the lawyer literally latched onto the case, and this lawsuit really helped them move in the right direction. Although Harris could hide behind a lawyer and remain silent during the criminal investigation, he still had to speak under oath while testifying in the civil lawsuit. He had to answer again the questions that were initially asked on the day of his wife's death. Did Jason cheat on his wife? Did he use illegal substances himself? Did he text Christy that morning to find out if she was awake? And the answers looked quite dubious. This man had never before inquired if his wife was all right. So what could have happened that morning that suddenly concerned him? Was she awake? And would she be late for work? It further emerged that Jason had slept in another room that night, although he told the court he had slept in the marital bed. Photos from the scene showed that the sheet on his side of the bed wasn't even wrinkled. And this was another small lie that Harris was passing off as truth for some reason. It was these minor inconsistencies that revealed a troubling picture of that morning and made detectives ask more and more questions. The compromising photo from the hard drive, where Jason held a tray with white powder on his lap, was explained by the man so stupidly that it became clear to anyone that he was lying. Harris explained to the police that he did this only to show his daughters how bad it was to use illegal substances. An interesting parenting technique, isn't it? Jason didn't expect the police to have such frank evidence of his harmful habits. At that moment, he began to realize that the walls around him were crumbling, and soon the detectives would dig up the truth. It was only a matter of time. His body language during interrogations indicated that he well understood the gravity of his situation. If at the very beginning Harris sat up straight and answered questions with slight carelessness, now he was hunched over and holding his head in his hands. There was no trace of his initial bravado left. The compromising photo and the testimony of colleagues led to the jury ultimately finding Jason Harris guilty of his wife Christy's death in the civil wrongful death lawsuit and ordered him to pay his wife's family $2 million. What contributed most to this was not so much the testimony and the photo of Harris having fun, but Christy's breast milk, which was accidentally preserved in the refrigerator. When Christina passed away, she had over 50 bags of breast milk left in her freezer. On each one, she had meticulously written the time and date of expression by hand. These packets of frozen milk became a crucial piece of evidence in the Harris family case. The mother and stepfather had been prudent in preserving it, knowing that analysis of this milk would reveal the true picture of events. A nursing mother wouldn't intentionally consume prohibited substances, as they would appear in her breast milk. This proved that Christy wasn't dependent on controlled substances and would never take them, as she could harm her own daughter. Christy loved her girls more than life itself. Thanks to the hours spent expressing breast milk, she managed to achieve justice even from beyond the grave. In fact, authorities immediately tested the milk for prohibited substances after the woman's death, as it was important evidence. They checked and found no traces of drugs but took no further action. The case was handled by a young police investigator. It was his first crime involving a person's death. He was inexperienced, overwhelmed, and overlooked things. More seasoned detectives were busy with other cases, so they didn't bother investigating why a young woman had died. As a result, Christy's family spent 2 years convincing local authorities to bring in state investigators. The Michigan State Police took on Christina Harris' case in 2016. However, they also made little progress until 2018, when the civil case was in full swing. A retest of the breast milk was conducted, again showing that Christy hadn't used prohibited substances for several weeks or even months prior to her death. This examination, combined with witness testimonies, made its impact. The deceased young woman's parents won the civil lawsuit, requiring the former son-in-law to pay $2 million. But this wasn't enough, because Jason was still free while their daughter lay in the ground. Jason hoped to relax after the stressful trial. Yes, he now owed a lot of money, but he'd avoided imprisonment. Fortunately, his relief was short-lived because in 2019, the medical examiner amended the cause of death on Christina's death certificate. Now, instead of accidental overdose, it stated intentional homicide. This change served as the basis for a criminal investigation into the crime. Investigators utilized the same evidence indicating Christy's death was violent: the breast milk, Jason's incriminating photo, and his colleagues' statements. They were confident they now had sufficient means to secure a conviction, so they made an arrest. The county prosecutor stated that Christy's husband, Jason, had a history of encounters with other women outside their marriage. Jason had repeatedly told his co-workers about this. He wanted his wife to disappear and even hired a hitman. While the hired killer was surveilling the target, police caught him with a firearm, which was prohibited for someone recently released from prison on parole. The would-be assassin was sent back to serve his sentence. It was then that Jason decided to take matters into his own hands. He first tried to find someone among his colleagues to carry out the act, but they refused. So he resolved to act independently. One evening, when Christy was tired after work and sat down for dinner, her spouse indeed prepared cereal with milk for her. However, before serving, he dissolved a considerable amount of a white substance in the milk, an overdose of which caused her sudden death. Experts confirmed that the milk masked the taste of the drug in the cereal, so Christy didn't detect it. The method of ingestion was oral, as Jason had no other way to make his wife take a large dose of the prohibited substance. Apparently, the powder's effects overtook Christy right at the table. She couldn't even hold her spoon. Jason, knowing what was happening, simply carried her to the bedroom for her to fall asleep forever. He intentionally didn't lie down next to her to avoid waking up in bed with his dead wife. The preliminary hearing took place in August 2019, during which the judge heard numerous incriminating testimonies, including those from Jason's own brother Jeff. It turned out that Jeff had supported Christy's family from day one, and he told them about Jason's desire to get rid of her. The fact that Jason was his biological brother didn't prevent the man from revealing the truth. A former colleague of Jason's also testified, describing the hitman and Jason's intentions to remove his wife to avoid paying alimony in a divorce. In Jason's view, Christina didn't want to return to work. She just lounged at home and did nothing. She was always expressing milk for some reason, even though baby formula had long been invented. Moreover, he wasn't sure of his paternity regarding the second girl, and overall, he was simply tired of his wife. All this served as evidence for the prosecution, strengthening their arguments. The actual trial began in November 2021. Jason faced 3 charges in total: first-degree felony, incitement to commit a felony, and use of a controlled substance resulting in death. The defense tried to prove that Christie was drug-dependent and knowingly took the substance. But the evidence refuting this was too compelling. Medical records, workplace tests, and the breast milk itself showed that Christie wasn't using the powder, as it would have risked her daughter's life. Despite the lawyer's efforts, he couldn't portray the victim in a negative light. Jason sat with his head down, looking very unwell, especially after the prosecution presented his motive. The man who sent his wife to the afterlife didn't expect his crime would ever be uncovered, let alone with such detail. The only thing not discussed in court was where Jason obtained the white powder, but judging by the photo of him sitting with a tray and straw, he had ways of acquiring it. When Jason stood trial, he stubbornly insisted on his innocence and denied all evidence, though it was foolish to deny such obvious facts. On November 17, 2021, the jury found Jason Harris guilty on all 3 counts, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge couldn't contain himself when it came to expressing personal opinions on all matters. He stated that while justice may have been delayed, it had now prevailed. The judge called Jason a selfish murderer and a lying monster who sacrificed not only his wife but also his daughters, taking away their mother and leaving them orphaned. Christie's family could finally breathe. They admitted that over the years, they had moments of doubt when it seemed Jason would get away with it. But the life sentence was worth all the struggle they had to endure. Although it won't bring back the mother to those poor girls or the daughter to her parents, the person who took Christie's life will rot in prison until his own death. The deceased's family will always carry this pain because Jason doesn't allow them to find peace. He has filed an appeal against his sentence. The appeal was rejected and the sentence upheld in January 2024. But Jason isn't giving up and plans to continue his attempts. Each time he does this, Christie's loved ones have to relive all the heartbreaking moments. Christina Harris' family did an amazing job questioning the accident, as it was initially determined. They fought for justice and ultimately achieved it. It might seem like everything ended wonderfully. However, the fight for justice shouldn't be the responsibility of the victim's family, and that's what's most upsetting about this story. This is the end of the story. Like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments. This was Jeremy. See you soon.